There are moments in life when the ground beneath your feet gives way, when what you thought was secure crumbles, when the work of your years is washed away in a single season, and you find yourself staring at emptiness with nothing left to hold on to. And that is where the story of a farmer begins. A man who measured his days not by the clock, but by the rhythm of the soil, whose hands were scarred with the memory of labor, whose back carried the weight of plows and sacks of grain, who trusted that if you worked long enough and gave enough sweat, the land would reward you with food. Yet one year everything changed. Storms gathered across the horizon like armies of darkness. Winds howled across the valley, rain fell without mercy. And when the fury was over, nothing remained but ruin. Acres of corn stalks bent and broken, leaves stripped, roots drowned in pools of standing water. The green that once promised abundance now twisted into mud, and the farmer stood in silence, boots sinking deep, staring at devastation. His heart as heavy as stone, his chest hollowed by grief, his lips unable to form words. Because how do you speak when everything is gone? How do you begin again when the barn is empty? How do you feed your children when the table holds only scraps? How do you rise when life has struck you down so low? Night after night he sat at the edge of his bed, staring into darkness, listening to the groan of the rafters, hearing the whisper of despair louder than the wind, telling himself he had failed, telling himself his story was finished. And though he prayed, the words fell heavy, as if heaven was silent. Yet in that silence, a thought pressed against his despair. Faint but unyielding, what if not all was lost? What if the story was not over? What if something still lived beneath the ruin? One morning he walked through the field, dragging his boots through the mud, and his tired eyes caught sight of a fragile green stem pushing upward. Small, trembling, yet alive, one survivor among thousands lost. And he knelt, tears burning his face, because in that moment, the smallest thing became the greatest gift. It was not the harvest he had dreamed of, but it was something. It was proof that life still dared to rise. And hope stirred, for hope is not born from plenty. It is born from a sign, however small, that tomorrow still comes. So he began to tend that seedling with reverence, shielding it from birds, carrying water to it, whispering prayers over it in the pale dawn, each day watching it stretch taller, leaves unfolding, roots pressing deeper. And though the rest of the land lay barren, this single plant became his teacher, teaching him that hope is not about pretending loss never happened, but about choosing to believe loss does not speak the final word. Each morning he rose not to mourn what was gone, but to nurture what remained. And the weight in his chest lightened. His neighbors shook their heads, saying one stalk could not change his season. But he smiled because his harvest was no longer measured in bushels. It was measured in courage, in resilience, in the quiet conviction that God had not abandoned him. Weeks passed, and the plant bore fruit, a single golden ear of corn. And when he held it in his rough hands, he felt reverence, because it was proof that from ruin can rise renewal. He saved the kernels carefully, drying them, storing them in a jar as though guarding treasure. And when spring returned, he planted them into the same soil that had once broken him. And this time rows upon rows of green shoots rose, swaying in the breeze, born from the seed that had endured. And his chest filled with gratitude, for he now understood hope was not fragile at all. It was the strongest force. It was the seed that takes root in the darkest ground. It grows when storms have passed and everything else is stripped away. It tells you no storm is forever, no failure is final, no soul is alone. The farmer shared his story with his children. He told them of the year the storms came, of the ruin that followed, and of the single seed that changed everything. He wanted them to know that even when the world breaks, God can still bring life from what seems dead. He wanted them to learn never to despise small beginnings, because inside a single beginning lives the promise of abundance. And he told his wife that though their table was once empty, it would never be again. Because they had learned that hope can feed more than the stomach. It feeds the soul. And even as his barns later overflowed with grain, he kept the jar of kernels on the shelf, above his bed, a reminder that when despair told him to quit, faith whispered, "Try again." He knew then that hope is not a luxury, but a necessity. It is the light that pierces the darkest night. It is the thread that holds the soul when everything else unravels. It is the quiet voice that tells you not all is lost. Maybe you too have walked through loss. Maybe you have stood at ruins, wondering if anything good can rise again. Maybe you have felt the silence of unanswered prayers, the heaviness of failure, the weight of despair. And if so, this story speaks to you, to remind you that sometimes hope begins with just one seed. One act of faith, one step forward. It may seem too small to matter, yet it carries the power to change everything. Hold on to it, nurture it, believe in it, and watch as God brings life where you thought only death could dwell. Because hope is alive, hope is waiting to grow in you. The farmer had lost his harvest, but he found something greater. He found the truth that even the smallest spark can be multiplied by God beyond measure. And that truth belongs not only to him, but to you. So do not turn away from the fragile shoots of faith in your life. Water them, guard them, pray over them. Trust that what God begins, he will complete. For one seed of hope can become a field of joy. One act of courage can grow into a harvest of peace. One whispered prayer can open a door of light. The story of the farmer is the story of every soul that dares to rise again after loss. It is a story still being written, perhaps in your life right now. And the farmer who once thought his life was over began to notice changes not only in the soil, but within himself. He found that he laughed more easily when his children played in the yard. He found that he spoke with more patience to his wife. He found that he no longer measured his worth only by barns filled with grain, but by the peace that came from trusting God. His neighbors began to wonder at the strength he carried. Some came asking how he had endured, and he would tell them about the single seed, about how in the middle of ruins God gave him one fragile gift, and how that gift taught him never to surrender to despair. And slowly others began to see their own lives differently. A widow who had lost her husband found comfort when she visited his farm and saw the field of green that had grown from one seed. A young man who had lost his job listened to the farmer's story and decided not to give up on searching for work. A friend who had fallen into debt found courage to keep going after hearing that loss is never the end. The farmer's story spread beyond the boundaries of his land. It became a reminder that hope is not meant to be hidden, it is meant to be shared. For when you share hope, it multiplies just as seeds multiply in the soil. And as the seasons turned year after year, the farmer kept planting, reaping, storing. But he never forgot that the true harvest was not in the barns, but in the hearts touched by his testimony. He learned that sometimes God allows storms to strip us bare so that we may learn where our true strength lies. Not in our own labor, but in his grace. And each time he saw clouds gathering, he no longer trembled in fear. For he had lived through ruin and discovered that even ruin cannot bury the seeds God protects. And maybe you too have stood at the edge of your own field of disappointment. Maybe you too have watched dreams collapse like stalks beaten by the storm. Maybe you too have wondered if anything can ever grow again in the soil of your life. And if so, let this story whisper to your heart that yes, it can. Yes, it will, for hope does not require perfect conditions. It only requires a willingness to believe that life is still possible. Faith is still possible. Love is still possible. And when you take the smallest seed of courage and place it into God's hands, He will do what only He can do. He will cause it to grow. He will cause it to bear fruit. And He will use it not only for you, but for others. For one seed of hope planted in your heart can bring nourishment to someone else who is starving for encouragement. One act of faith can inspire another act of faith. One testimony of survival can spark another story of redemption. And this is how the world is healed, not all at once in great sweeping victories, but quietly, steadily through small seeds of hope that multiply. And so as you listen to this story, remember that the farmer is not far from you. His story is yours. His soil is your soil. His storms are your storms, and his God is your God. The same God who brings life from one fragile seed longs to bring life from the broken ground of your heart. So do not despise the season you are in, even if it feels barren, for seeds are buried before they rise. And what looks like death may only be the hidden beginning of new life. Hold on, press forward, trust that what God starts, He will finish. And when you see the first fragile sprout of hope rise in your life, bend low. Tend it, protect it, believe in it, for it carries within it the harvest you cannot yet imagine. And when the time comes, share your story, for there is someone waiting to hear it. Someone who needs to know that hope is real. Someone who needs the reminder that even after loss, life can rise again. And if this story touched your heart, I invite you now to carry it forward. Write your reflections in the comments. Share the seed of hope you have seen in your own journey. And join our community here at Faith Light Stories, where we remind one another that light still shines even in the darkest night. Subscribe and help us spread these stories, because you never know whose heart may be lifted by the seed of hope you carry today.